Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Rise of China, the economic revolution that made China a superpower by epic history. Now this is their last episode in their series on 20th century Chinese history. Last time we made it to the start of the era of Deng Xiaoping. Today we will learn how China became the global modern superpower that it is today. A lot of fascinating stuff to talk about in this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Setting things right. Deng Xiaoping's guiding philosophy. Reform and opening up. 1978.
1978. And China has a new leader, the 74-year-old Deng Xiaoping. Deng's record as a reformer, as well as his frank and avuncular manner, is a stark contrast to the memory of Mao Zedong.
Yeah, Deng Xiaoping, a man who is already so late into his life, but only now is reaching the pinnacle of his power. We've seen him throughout this series. He's been a reformer. He has been in and out of favor several times. In fact, sometimes he has been entirely removed from power, but now he's back, and he's back in a big way. And we can see already that the fact that Deng Xiaoping wants to reform, that he wants to set things right, shows that he thinks things have gone a little bit off course. Now, to be fair, at this time, a lot of people in Chinese society thought that. Some didn't. Your most hardcore Maoists thought things had been moving in the right direction. But a lot of people thought it was time for a correction. And that correction is what Deng Xiaoping is going to achieve.
Deng is convinced that only the Chinese Communist Party can lead China to prosperity. But he also believes major reforms are necessary to do it.
And this will be a really interesting video to go through, right? Deng Xiaoping is able to conduct these pretty massive reforms in China while still holding on to power, right? While the Communist Party stays in absolute power. Now, you can contrast that with, for example, the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union, really through the 70s into the 80s, stagnated. You had this class of pretty corrupt and aging bureaucrats ruling the party, and then you get the figure of Gorbachev, who in perhaps a similar way, and in some ways differently than Deng Xiaoping, tries to reform the Soviet Union. What does that lead to? It leads to the collapse of the entire country. Right, so clearly things went differently in China and the USSR, and so I think it's interesting to examine how did Deng Xiaoping manage to do that while still holding on to power for the Communist Party.
His views are echoed by prominent supporters, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, who Deng describes as his left and right hands. Together they promote the four modernizations in agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology.
They love a good four blanks in China, the four olds, the four modernizations. This is probably a reference to some of those other four blanks. Or a response.
But there is also a growing number who question China's repressive system.
Uh-oh.
Encouraged by Deng's talk of ideological liberation, activists stick up political posters along Beijing's Xidan Street.
Right, and this is the thing. Look, we're talking about reform. Now, reform can mean a lot of different things. For Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, he first essentially tried some economic reform, and then finding that the party was so entrenched that he couldn't really get anything by, he then went to political reform, opening up the government, allowing more free speech, and that reform grew and grew and grew until it toppled the system of Soviet government. So Gorbachev ended up doing several kinds of reform. Here in China, Deng Xiaoping is most interested in economic reform. But as you see with the example of Gorbachev, oftentimes one type of reform can lead to others, right? You start slow, start with making minor changes, and those changes quickly spiral out of control, right? And so a lot of people in this moment, people who may be dissatisfied with the current system, are seeing this sort of new wave of ideology Deng Xiaoping is bringing in, this idea of reform, and they're saying, hey, that's great, let's reform the entire system. But that's not quite what he's going for.
It becomes known as the Democracy Wall. Many of the posters criticize Mao and the Gang of Four.
Whoa. And, the Gang of Four, they had certainly, we saw what happened to them last time, so that's not necessarily beyond the pale, but criticizing Mao, that's pretty crazy, right? I mean, we saw that the Gang of Four really was able to take the heat for a lot of things that Mao was responsible for. And so Mao was able to remain this almost deified figure in the popular imagination. And so to critique Mao, that's to take things a step further.
Deng Xiaoping tolerates this criticism of his predecessors, even as so-called big character posters spread across Beijing and other major cities. People have grievances, and they should be allowed to express them.
Okay.
Deng tells an American journalist.
Interesting.
Most posters are anonymous. But in December 1978, Wei Jingsheng, an electrician and former Red Guard, posts an essay entitled The Fifth Modernization.
Oh. Interesting, from someone who was a Red Guard. Let's hear what he has to say.
Signing it with his real name and address, he argues that democracy is essential for the welfare of the Chinese people.
Uh-oh.
Democracy, freedom, and happiness for all are our sole objectives in carrying out modernization, he writes. Now, the limits to the new spirit of openness are revealed.
Yeah, you've gone a little too far. And one thing I think we'll learn about Deng Xiaoping in comparison to someone like a Gorbachev, and not to keep making the same comparison, but it's just on my mind given how I've framed what happens in China versus what happens in the USSR, is that Gorbachev, when it really came time, he was not willing to use mass violence in the way that his predecessors were. Now, I'm not saying no repression happened under Gorbachev, but he would often back down from that type of repression and violence. Deng Xiaoping, he may be a reformer in some ways, but he is still willing to use the levers of violence and repression that are available to him with the Chinese state.
Wei Jingsheng and 30 other activists are arrested and given long jail sentences.
To uphold socialism, we must eliminate poverty. Poverty is not socialism. Fair enough. Seems like a good step to take, eliminate poverty. But much harder said than done, right? And Deng Xiaoping is maybe going to lay out a way that it can be done, but many world leaders have tried to eliminate poverty, and many world leaders have tried to eliminate socialism, but that's a different thing. For example, Lyndon B. Johnson in the United States, he made a good attempt to eliminate poverty in the U.S., and he had a whole series of Great Society programs, but alas, poverty still remains, so let's see how Deng Xiaoping does. Though he definitely made progress, I'll give him credit. Socialism with Chinese characteristics.
In March 1979, Deng Xiaoping introduces 4 basic principles. 1. Uphold the socialist road. 2. Uphold the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. Uphold the leadership of the Communist Party. 4. Uphold Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Any misapprehension that Deng's reforms will include an end to one-party rule are firmly laid to rest.
Yes, so we can see here that Deng Xiaoping is doing a couple of things, right? Though he has some pretty, ambitious economic reforms coming, he's signaling to everybody that no, these will not be accompanied by social or political reforms on the same level. We are still going to stick to the ideology we've been with. In fact, we're going to continue to uphold Mao Zedong. As I mentioned earlier, even though Mao and Deng Xiaoping were often quite opposed, a lot of the blame for mistakes that were made and decisions that were made have been placed on those around Mao, on the Gang of Four, and so now even reformers like Deng continue to hold up Mao as, like I said, this almost deified ideological figure alongside the likes of Marx and Lenin, right? So it's an interesting position that Deng has taken, where he knows that his reforms that he's doing are perhaps not the most socialist of socialist reforms, and so he's trying to keep the ideology strong.
Nevertheless, his planned economic reforms are ambitious and far-reaching.
Yeah.
Deng signals his desire to strengthen international relations and expand trade during a landmark visit to the United States. It's the first by a Chinese leader since 1943.
And you see relations between the US and China begin to move upwards to improve, until, of course, they reach a high point and now have been declining for a couple of years.
In Texas, his evident enjoyment of American traditions helps win over the crowds.
That's funny.
And underscores his pragmatic approach to China's foreign relations.
I mean, shout out, bro, knew what he was doing. He visited Texas, put on a cowboy hat. Everyone loves him now. Coca-Cola.
Deng's goal is to lift millions of ordinary Chinese out of poverty and into the middle class. The means will be a new economic system. Socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, and you often hear this thrown around today, and we're seeing it develop right here with Deng Xiaoping. So we're going to learn what he means by socialism with Chinese characteristics.
For the first time, elements of market capitalism will be introduced into what has been a rigidly state-controlled communist model. Decisions will be decentralized, industries opened to private enterprise, and price controls loosened.
Yeah, I mean, socialism with Chinese characteristics is essentially socialism as you see it practiced in China today, right? So separate from Mao Zedong thought, it's the Chinese model, right? Where you basically have, oftentimes people will call it state capitalism, which I almost think is a more accurate term for it, rather than socialism. I mean, you could debate this for hours and hours and days. Honestly, the terms of capitalism and socialism sometimes get a little vague because there's many different iterations of both. The socialism of China today is definitely not, I don't know, the socialism of Marx, for example, right? So yeah, whether you feel like it's some type of mixed economy, socialism with sort of market characteristics, or with Chinese characteristics, or whether you see it as state capitalism, just kind of how I see it, to be honest with you. It is this market system where the government has massive control over the economy. However you want to view it, that is what we're talking about here. And that is, of course, the Chinese economic system that still exists now.
However, the changes will be introduced cautiously, and all aspects of the economy will remain under close government supervision. Special economic zones will be the blazing beacons of China's new economic era.
Yeah.
Inspired by the post-war booms in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan, the first SEZs are all on the coast to facilitate foreign investment.
And I was just going to say, what you see here is the development of cities like Shenzhen, which is pretty well known today. These cities developing to become something more like Hong Kong, right? Cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, but the best example here is Hong Kong, given the fact that it's so proximate to these other Chinese cities. It had developed in this pretty impressive way economically, and now the rest of China wants to, at least some cities that Deng Xiaoping is designating as these special zones, he wants to develop them in the same way, which he is going to do.
They include Shenzhen, just 15 miles from Hong Kong, and Xiamen, opposite Taiwan. Many more will follow in the 1980s. The SEZs offer foreign investors access to China's plentiful cheap labor and raw materials, with less regulation and lower taxes.
And this is how China becomes the manufacturer of the world. And I'm sure we'll see that throughout this video. You get these special economic zones opened up. They're opened up to foreign investment. And so it allows these multinational corporations from around the world, a lot of American corporations, but from other wealthy countries as well, to come to invest money, to set up factories, and to produce their products at a cheaper price, because less labor regulation, they're paying less in salary, all these types of things. And so you see a mass migration of the production of goods towards China. Now, that's a process that had already been occurring in other countries, right? By 1980, a lot of industrial production had already been moving out of countries like the United States and Western Europe to places throughout Asia in particular. That led to the economic development of a lot of these Asian countries. But now, in a big way, China is absorbing even more of that industrial production. And of course, you see a lot of other countries deindustrializing, for example, like the US and a lot of European countries, to end up where we are today.
They are touted as gateways to China, ports through which a booming trade in imports and exports can be established. The SEZs are a massive success, attracting huge amounts of foreign investment, new factories, and jobs. In the countryside, Mao's mass collectivization programs are rolled back. Rural households are allocated their own land, with more freedom in how they choose to farm it. Over the next 6 years, 97% of peasant households move from collective to individual land ownership.
So a massive shift there, and what we see essentially is the implementation of pragmatism, where Deng Xiaoping looks at the decisions that have been made, oftentimes ideologically, and says, okay, what is working and what is not working, right? And he's trying to make the state and the economy function better and more efficiently. You see changes similar to this actually in Cuba, I believe in the 80s or 90s. I know a little less about Cuba, where you see some market implementation as well, right? So it's just applying some pragmatism to the economy and to sort of state operation in China.
Agricultural output increases by more than 60%. Hunger and famine, which have haunted Chinese peasants for millennia, become a thing of the past. Thousands of students and officials who had been exiled to rural areas during the Cultural Revolution are allowed to return to the cities and resume their functions. Entrance exams to universities, suspended during the Cultural Revolution, are reintroduced in 1977. And academic life resumes in universities across the country. Abroad, China continues to assert its influence as a major regional power.
Yeah, it's growing influence.
To the south, in Indochina, it has supported two communist insurgencies in Vietnam and Cambodia. After long struggles, both have secured control in their respective countries.
Yeah, I'd say one of those went better than the other.
But by the late 1970s, China's relations with communist Vietnam are deteriorating fast. After the Soviet-China split, Vietnam sides with its other backer, the Soviet Union. In 1978, Vietnam invades Khmer Rouge-controlled Cambodia, led by Pol Pot, threatening to overthrow China's other regional ally.
Yeah, and I mean, whatever you think of Vietnam, Pol Pot was a straight up psychopath. I mean, the Khmer Rouge were incredibly, incredibly brutal, right? So the communist experiments in these two countries went far, far better in Vietnam than it did in Cambodia.
Outraged, China launches a limited invasion of Vietnam the following year. But it is a costly affair. Experienced Vietnamese forces inflict an estimated 20,000 casualties on the People's Liberation Army.
Yet the Vietnamese have gotten pretty good at fighting at this point. Fighting against the United States, well, first fighting against the French, fighting against the United States, fighting against the Khmer Rouge in this case, right? Which is, communist country versus communist country, but the Khmer Rouge were so violent and extreme and also anti-Vietnamese that, Vietnam, invades and takes a stand. But yeah, Vietnam is pretty used to warfare at this point. They're experienced.
Chinese military deficiencies are exposed, leading to a thorough overhaul and modernization of its armed forces. Attacking Vietnam, a Soviet ally, does no harm to China's relations with the West, however,
right,
which continue to improve. Deng Xiaoping hosts state visits by the Prime Ministers of Great Britain and Japan, the President of France, and Queen Elizabeth II.
So yeah, this is helping China's reputation among these Western powers, especially because for a while the United States, good old Kissinger, were propping up Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. So anyway, that, along with what we see here generally, is helping China's reputation among its new Western allies.
Deng is Time magazine's Man of the Year. Twice.
Not bad.
Deng even softens official language toward the old enemy, nationalist-controlled Taiwan. Communist China's stated strategy towards Taiwan becomes one of peaceful reunification rather than liberation. But Deng's offer to incorporate Taiwan into the People's Republic of China under a one country, two systems formula is rejected by Taiwan's president, Jiang Jingkuo, son of Chiang Kai-shek. China's new confidence abroad is seen in its promotion of Pinyin, the new phonetic system for spelling Mandarin Chinese using the Latin alphabet.
Yep, and I think we've talked about this before, but this is why we see in English and in, Western journalism and writing, these names change over time.
The international media finally learns to call Peking Beijing.
Yeah.
At home, however, the Communist Party's control over society remains as firm as ever. Since 1949, China's population has been growing at an unprecedented rate. This was the result of giant strides in public health, while Mao and the government had encouraged and rewarded large families. In just 30 years, China's population has nearly doubled, from 550 million to around 1 billion.
Wow.
It's a rate that many experts believe is unsustainable and harmful to prosperity. And so, in 1980, China introduces a one-child policy. For most families, a second child will now lead to heavy fines and other penalties.
I mean, it's crazy not just to promote having smaller families, but to literally legislate against having a bigger family, to impose consequences for most families if you have more than one kid. It's like, okay, you're taking it perhaps a step too far, and there are some very negative consequences that come from this policy.
In some cases, there are even forced abortions and sterilization. The consequence will be a generation of single-child families with a strong gender imbalance in favor of males.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting trends you see here, is that one-child policy, as in China, as in many or most countries around the world, there is, of course, bias present, right? There is patriarchy present, right? And so men have a better deal of things than women. And so what you see is a gender bias towards male children, which means that, if a family's going to have a female child, they might have it aborted, they might get rid of the kid, whatever it is, so that their one official child can be a male child, right? So some pretty dark stuff here.
Strict family planning laws are just one way that the Communist Party has transformed the roles and experience of women living in China. Mao declared that women hold half the sky, and in the 1950s he'd introduced laws to improve women's rights in marriage, divorce and property. By the late 70s, it is estimated that up to 90% of women based in urban areas are in work. In 1980, China is among the first to ratify the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. But ambitions and declarations do not always match reality.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see this, there was sort of a similar thing in the Soviet Union, where, these countries see themselves as deeply egalitarian, not just on an economic, but also a social front. However, sometimes the ideology does not match the practice. Now, there were definitely gains in women's rights in the USSR and in China. That is undeniable, pretty major gains in women's rights. But if you just interview women from those countries throughout the 20th century, they will tell you that, yeah, things may have improved, but what I was experiencing in my life did not match with the proclamations. I was still experiencing sexism and misogyny, and there was not equal treatment, even though there was supposed to be, right? So, and you see that with the results of the one-child policy, that gender imbalance towards male children, right? Theoretically, there is this gender equality here, and there is advancement made. Well, once again, I don't want to deny that, but of course, the truth on the ground is that there is not real gender equality. And obviously that, persists to this day in, once again, many, if not most countries around the world.
Women remain underrepresented in China's political and economic leadership. And as with much development in China, many reforms take much longer to reach rural communities.
Yeah.
Progress is being made, but for many, not quickly enough.
Students, we came too late. Whatever you say and criticize about us is deserved. Oh my. Tiananmen Square. Here we go, folks.
For many, China...
this is, just before we get into it, this is a big moment. 1989, an exciting time around the world. Big things are happening. I've been talking about the Soviet Union during this episode. The USSR is pretty close to collapse at this point, right? And China's facing a lot of tension of its own.
As economic reforms fuel hopes for political change, especially with the rise to prominence of Xiaoping, Deng's old ally, now General Secretary of the party. Hu is an unusually outspoken and open-minded member of the Politburo. He advocates greater openness and challenges the privileges of the princelings, the children of senior Communist Party officials.
Oh my.
He is hugely popular with the people.
And that's something you saw in the USSR as well, which is in these countries that saw themselves as deeply egalitarian, like I said, with gender equality, the practice on the ground did not match always with the ideology, right? And it seems to me that in just about every society, whatever form of government or economy, there's going to be some type of hierarchy. And so the hierarchy that develops in China and the USSR is that party members are privileged, right? Especially important party members. And the family of party members, they form the sort of upper class of their respective societies, right? They have a lot of power. So, that is the hierarchy that you see developing there. And in fact, if you look at the USSR, its collapse and the transition to the countries that form up that region today, particularly Russia, you will see that a lot of the Russian oligarchs were people who were powerful and had a lot of resources in the Soviet Union. They were the ones, unsurprisingly, who were able to secure control over the economy and the government after the collapse of the USSR as well. So in some ways, some things stayed the same. There will always be these powerful economic and political elites who assert themselves on everybody else.
Many reformers hope he will, in time, succeed Deng as supreme leader. In 1986, popular discontent leads to student protests across China, with calls for greater openness and democracy.
And I think this whole process is very interesting, right? Once again, when we take a look at the Soviet Union, that whole country is going to collapse, right? Now, Gorbachev he did not achieve the incredible economic growth that China did. Why? There's been a lot written on that, and I really couldn't tell you. I'm not an expert. I think part of that is due to the fact that China had this more dynamic political and economic system. There was more change over time. The death of Mao, in particular, allowed for a lot of reform and a lot of change, and they had a leader, Deng Xiaoping, who seized control of that, whereas the USSR had become incredibly sclerotic. This very corrupt system where these elites were just sort of satisfied with doing what they had already done and continuing to fake all their quotas. So it was very hard for Gorbachev to reform the economy and improve the economy. And then when it came to the politics, right, he began slowly to accept some of these political reforms and even push for them. And when it got out of his hand, once again, I think an important part of this is that Gorbachev, and there's varying opinions on Gorbachev, but I think this is something admirable. Some don't. But Gorbachev was not willing to use force to impose his authority, right? When the Soviet republics began to separate themselves, he was not willing to send in tanks to crush them, like had been done in Hungary in the 1950s. He was just not willing to put down these political movements with mass violence. Once again, not to say there was no political violence or repression under Gorbachev, there was, but when it came time, he was typically one who backed down, which is why there was a hardcore communist coup against him, because they wanted him to step up and push back and fight back. But Gorbachev just wasn't really willing to do it. I think he didn't see it was worth it, right? He didn't think it was worth it to injure and take many lives in order to hold on control. And that led to the collapse of the USSR, one of the many things that led to the collapse of the USSR, which is all very complicated. But in China, something different happens.
When Deng Xiaoping orders Hu to break up the student protests, he refuses.
Oh.
Hu is forced to resign and perform humiliating self-criticism in front of his colleagues. 2 years later, in the midst of a Politburo meeting, he has a heart attack and dies.
Jesus Christ.
The death of such a popular figure, seen as unfairly treated by an out-of-touch party, provokes a huge public reaction. Thousands of mourners gather in Beijing. They gravitate towards Tiananmen Square, where mourning turns into protest.
Yep.
Just as it did after the death of Zhou Enlai.
Yep.
Exactly 70 years after the iconic protests of 1919.
Wow.
100,000 students take part in demonstrations, once more calling for Mr. Democracy.
And so we see that these mass events, like funerals for popular figures like Zhou Enlai, they turn into these moments where people feel more free, not very free, to express their political opinions. And that's how you get protests and demonstrations.
On the 13th of May, hundreds begin a hunger strike, hoping to pressure the government into negotiations.
I want to say to the government, what we want is only the democracy, only the freedom of the speech, not overthrow the government. We support our government to go on the reform, economic reform and the political reform.
The new party general secretary is Zhao Ziyang, another of Deng's protégés. On the 19th of May, Zhao visits the protest camp, expressing concern and sympathy. At 69, he is one of the younger members of the Politburo and tells students...
69, one of the younger members, right? So, once again, this was the issue that they experienced in the USSR. You've got it in China. This is the problem we have in the United States today, where, feels like all of our leaders are in their damn 80s. Not all of them, but that'd be the same thing in the United States Congress today. Or, for example, running for U.S. president. If you're, like, in your 60s, or God forbid your 50s, you're a young spring chicken compared to all these politicians in their 70s and 80s, and some even older than that. A gerontocracy is a word for it.
We are already old and do not matter. State Premier Li Peng is a far more conservative figure. He wins Deng's backing for a tough response to the protests. There will be no negotiation.
And this, I think, is a key moment in the history of modern China.
No concessions. Instead, martial law is declared. And on the night of the 3rd of June, troops and tanks are sent in to clear Tiananmen Square by any means necessary. The result is a massacre. Official figures state that 218 civilians and 23 security personnel were killed, with several thousand injured. Many are skeptical of these numbers, believing the real death toll to be much higher. In the aftermath, cameras capture a remarkable moment of defiance.
Yeah.
A lone, anonymous man on Chang'an Avenue, blocking a column of tanks.
And of course, this picture has become extraordinarily famous today.
The incident is seen around the world.
Yeah.
Tank Man becomes a globally famous symbol of resistance to authoritarianism. Despite strict censorship, further reports and some footage of the bloody events emerge. The international media is quick to condemn the massacre. But the Chinese government never deviates from its official line. Speaking a few days after the event, Deng Xiaoping, now 84 years old, denounces the protests as a counter-revolutionary rebellion, fully warranting a military response.
Classic.
General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who had gone to meet the protesters, is removed from office and spends 15 years under house arrest.
Jesus Christ. So, this is the moment when, in an alternate history, the revolution begins, right? This is the moment you see in many different rebellions and revolutions throughout history, where you have mass protests, people are dissatisfied with the government, you get a massacre, and that was truly a massacre of quite a large scale, and it leads to revolution. Now, why does that not happen here? Well, I mean, there's a bunch of different reasons. I think one of them, as compared to other examples, is that the Chinese government is truly steadfast and brutal in their response. You can look, for example, at the French Revolution with Louis XVI. He was a vacillating, weak figure. He was never quite sure how to respond and how to respond forcefully. And so he didn't really respond forcefully. Now you can look once again at someone like a Gorbachev, who also just did not respond in the most forceful manner. This is different. You have a forceful, direct crackdown. I think another big part of it, and this is more of a general point in the years to follow, another part of it is that the dissatisfaction with the government simply is not high enough. And that's because people are largely satisfied with the economic reforms of the government, right? You even saw from that protester there, he said, we don't want to overthrow the government. We like the economic reforms. We want more reforms. We just want them to be democratic reforms as well. And so when this happens, there are not enough people who are truly feeling desperate and dissatisfied and angry, and that's what it takes for a revolution to actually stand up and do something. A lot of people are feeling like, you know what, economically, I'm doing pretty well. You know, things are pretty good. And so it's just not the time to do something, right? I mean, always look at the money. And when looking at political decisions, that's a massive factor in any sort of decision-making.
Li Peng remains China's state premier for 9 more years. Later that year, Deng Xiaoping formally retires from frontline politics. And it appears he is handing power back to the party's reactionaries and conservatives. Deng's era of reforms has stalled. China seems to be going backwards.
Well, reform is China's second revolution. From Deng Xiaoping. Interesting perspective, Deng. Prosperity without freedom. It's a good way to put it.
The Tiananmen Square massacre.
That, prosperity without freedom. The Soviets could not get prosperity, and so they needed freedom. They had freedom without prosperity, and then, frankly, that freedom pretty quickly disappeared through the 90s in Russia. It was a pretty authoritarian government, even at the end of the 90s under Yeltsin, and then especially under Putin. And they did not have prosperity, really, until the end of the 90s either. But point still stands. They couldn't have their prosperity, and so they acquired their freedom for a brief moment. China, they've got the prosperity, they just don't have the freedom.
The Tiananmen Square massacre badly damages China's international reputation.
Yeah.
And once again, the country finds itself isolated. Many contrast events in China with recent reforms in Taiwan, which has undergone a period of liberalization. Martial law had been lifted for the first time in 1987, paving
the first time in 1987. Taiwan, for a while, had been a place you really would not want to live in, alright? I mean, they had economic development as well, but they lived under this far-right authoritarian system for decades and decades. But now, just as you're seeing changes in a lot of countries, you're seeing Taiwan liberalize and become the sort of liberal democracy slowly that it is today.
Way for the island's first full parliamentary elections in 1991. The economy is booming, fueled by foreign investment and led by new companies such as the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
Oh man.
TSMC.
TSMC. Talk about a company that's at the center of global geopolitics today. Right? Everyone's fighting over these chips. The semiconductor producers. TSMC, very important in all this process. This is where a lot of the tension between China, Taiwan, and the United States comes from today, as in the production of these chips that nowadays we use for like everything. They're in every piece of technology that we use. They're necessary to the functioning of a modern state, a modern economy. So, the sort of supply issues, they cause political issues around the world.
Today, it's the world's largest chip maker, an industry that will transform Taiwan's economy.
Yeah. And like I said, just to reiterate the point, the United States' interest in Taiwan, sure, it's ideological in part, but let's be honest, the real interest is economic. It's in those chips. That is what really keeps the U.S. involved. They need that steady supply of chips that now is being used for AI, of course, NVIDIA, all this type of stuff. But even beyond the AI bubble, maybe not bubble, that we currently have. These chips are, like I said, powering modern economies.
In contrast, China's perceived regression leads to a significant fall in foreign investment, as the United States and European Union impose sanctions.
What? And also we're hitting 1992 now, so this is a time when, the Western powers felt pretty dominant. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, right? George Herbert Walker Bush feels like, that's it, capitalism is won, liberal democracy is won. We rule the world. It's the Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. There was this idea that communism's gone. The Soviet Union, the big enemy of America, has collapsed, right? It's a new era, an era, once again, of capitalism and liberalism and all these types of things. And so, Tiananmen Square, along with this broader global shift, is sort of turning a lot of opinions in the West against China at this point.
World Bank suspends loans. Economic forecasts for China are downgraded. China's economic stagnation will stir Deng Xiaoping into action once more.
Right, and of course the remarkable thing about this is that, as we know, this is not, the point where China stalls and stagnates, or the point where it declines or falls into revolution. Oh no, this is only the beginning of its advancement to the modern power it is today, right? That's the remarkable part of all this.
In 1992, aged 87,
wow,
he embarks on a southern tour, visiting successful special economic zones where he demands bolder leadership and greater energy in the drive for economic development. He dismisses the old dogma that a socialist state must be a planned economy, with no role for a capitalist market. Single-handedly, through his immense personal influence, Deng puts reform back at the center of the agenda. Though never explicitly stated, a new contract between the Chinese Communist Party and the people is being written.
Yes.
Legitimacy, in exchange for growth, prosperity, and national resurgence.
Yeah, and this is sort of what I was referring to earlier when I said that, the economic conditions were not bad enough for people to turn against their government, right? Every government needs legitimacy in one form or another, and most governments derive their legitimacy from a bunch of different sources, right? You can have legitimacy from your history, you can have legitimacy in terms of your ideology or your politics. We are legitimate as a communist state, right? And that's why you should believe in us. Legitimacy for a lot of reasons, but some states, Singapore is a good example of this, their legitimacy comes from their economic success, right? Essentially, as long as we continue to grow and we, the government, delivers economically for you, the people, you will continue to support us. And that is one of the big forms of legitimacy the modern Chinese state has, right? As long as China continues to grow economically and deliver for its people, the people will continue to support or at least tolerate the current government and system, even if they may not be super satisfied with the lack of civil rights or free speech or those types of things. As long as they have that source of economic legitimacy, people will largely be all right. Now, there's other forms of legitimacy in China, right? China's got a long and storied history. There's a lot of nationalism among the people of China. There is still an ideological belief in their socialism or state capitalism or whatever you want to call it, right? So there's several sources of legitimacy. Of course, in a sense, force can also be one of those sources in, a lot of different countries. But for China, economic growth is a massive, massive source of legitimacy for the government.
The party upholds its side of the deal. The 1992 Party Congress declares China a socialist market economy.
Socialist market economy, right? Which some of us would call, I think, state capitalism. That's what I'd call it, at least. But once again, this is all pretty complicated, right? Like, You have mixed economies. Like I said, there's different types of capitalism and socialism. Sometimes I think these words are not so useful. There's even overlap on the edges there. Do you have a sort of somewhat socialized capitalism, or do you have a socialist market economy? What is this? I don't know. But state capitalism is a word that some people use for this type of system. At the very least, it's a type of socialism with a pretty strong market economy and capitalist elements, but which the government still maintains a lot of control over.
Now on, markets, not the state, will set the prices for goods, services, labour and capital. Many state-owned enterprises are reformed, privatised or allowed to fail, as large-scale private businesses take over. GDP leaps from 3.9% in 1990 to 14.2% in 1992.
Jesus.
And remains high for a decade. According to World Bank figures, in 1990, more than 80% of the population lived in extreme poverty. Over the next 30 years, that number plummets to 0%.
And this, there have been a bunch of economic miracles over the past couple decades since World War II, but frankly, this is the economic miracle of the post-war period. Since the Second World War, this is probably the most impressive economic achievement, is how successful the Chinese economy has been, and that this one country single-handedly, because of its economic growth and how populated it is, it has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and most of them into a middle-class lifestyle, right? There's still some people, especially in the rural areas of China, it is still comparatively underdeveloped, but a lot of the Chinese population now lives a middle or upper-class lifestyle where they have a lot of amenities available to them, right? So like I said, this is the sort of economic miracle of the modern world. It is incredible growth at a truly remarkably fast pace.
Some regard it as one of the greatest economic miracles in history.
Yes, I'd agree.
A vast multitude lifted out of extreme poverty in record time.
It is that. Whatever else you think of China and Deng Xiaoping and whatever, I feel like it's hard to deny that this is an incredible economic achievement. It just is.
But there's another side to this unprecedented economic boom. For decades, the Chinese government had subsidized housing and food. But now, price controls and parts of the social welfare system are removed.
Well, right, their socialism is bringing on a lot of capitalism, right? And perhaps it is capitalism, so they're losing some of those more socialist aspects that had propped up some parts of life.
Many find themselves abandoned and struggling to get by. Now there is more unemployment, corruption, pollution, and dramatically rising inequality, especially between urban and rural populations.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, right? I would say largely this is a story of incredible economic success. There are some people who are being left behind in unemployment and things like that, but truly the level of economic growth is incredible, unparalleled. But I'd say, yeah, one of the big issues with that is the growing inequality, right? So you see, as China begins to take on this foreign investment, as it begins to develop these markets and really a market economy, you see an incredible amount of inequality growing, like we see in, most countries around the world, but especially those with particularly unregulated markets like the United States. You see an incredible amount of inequality. Now, there's a couple of different perspectives on inequality. There's the belief that inequality in itself is bad or harmful, and so equality should be prioritized, whereas some people believe that inequality in itself is fine, as long as some people, the people who are doing worse, are still doing all right, right? If there's a certain base level of performance, you'll be fine. Even if your neighbor's doing way, way, way better than you, if you've got a base level that you can do, then the inequality's all right. And some believe that inequality is good, should be something to be achieved under a capitalist system, and that there should be no bottom level of sort of standard of living, that you should be able to sink all the way through the bottom if you do, right? So these different perspectives on inequality, I'd argue that whatever your perspective is, just typically when we see rising inequality, you're going to see more dissatisfaction. You're going to see frustration from people, right? I feel like those two things do correspond. There's a correlation. And so you see that growing inequality in China. Inequality, whether you think it's, inherently bad on its own or it just leads to bad outcomes or whatever, typically most people are not a fan of inequality. It does not create a lot of enjoyment or a lot of trust in the economic system. But then again, if everyone is seeing economic benefits like they are in China, then maybe you can sort of ignore that inequality for a while. But for how long?
As a result, tens of millions of the rural poor move to booming cities, where strict residential permit requirements, known as the Hukou system, renders them second-class citizens, locked out of state benefits.
That is a big issue in China where, you essentially have migrant laborers, but within your own country, right? Usually migrant laborers come from abroad, right? And oftentimes migrant laborers are quite abused by whatever government or system they're living within. They have less rights, less protections than, native workers or naturalized workers. You see that in China, but a lot of these migrant workers are Chinese people from China. They're just not registered in the particular city or region that they're in right now. But they still have less protections and less rights than the people who are supposed to be there as determined by the government.
In 1997, Deng Xiaoping dies, aged 92.
Not bad.
The scale of his legacy, though contested, is hard to overstate.
Agreed.
Under Deng's leadership, China's economic potential has finally been unleashed, and living standards have soared. To his admirers, Deng is one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century. To his detractors, he used economic reforms to entrench one-party communist rule.
Well, why can't two things be true at once? Deng Xiaoping was an incredible statesman, created this incredible economic growth, maybe not created, but facilitated it, and yes, he used his economic reforms to entrench the party's authoritarian power. Two things can be true at the same time. That's what I think, at least. And like I've said, I think whatever you think of Deng Xiaoping and of China, and I feel like I've shared plenty of my own criticisms, it's just undeniable that this was an incredible economic miracle, where hundreds of millions of people were truly pulled out of poverty and into a relatively middle-class standard of life. That's just hard to overstate, honestly. This is why, in the Western world, there are a lot of China detractors, a lot of people who are not a fan, but even they recognize China's incredible growth, its incredible power. No one denies that. Even those who are extremely negative against China, they still recognize that China is a powerhouse.
The man who oversaw Mao's brutal anti-rightist campaigns of the 1950s remained true to the party to the end.
Yeah, he did not lose that brutal streak. He used it. Our people are a great people. As long as we unite as one, there's no difficulty that we cannot overcome. From Xi Jinping. Return of the Middle Kingdom. Yeah.
Deng's successor as paramount leader is Jiang Zemin. Jiang, politically conservative but an economic reformer, is known for his outgoing personality and is the first Chinese leader to speak both English and Russian.
Oh, nice.
Working with State Premier Li Peng, he ensures the country holds its course, balancing a growing economy with a highly centralized state. Abroad, Jiang carries on Deng's cautious approach, described as choosing to hide one's talent and bide one's time. But world leaders now choose their words carefully, as their economies become increasingly dependent on Chinese trade. In July 1997, Hong Kong is peacefully transferred from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China, marking the end of 156 years of colonial rule. It is a hugely symbolic moment for an increasingly assertive China, definitively turning the page on its century of humiliation.
Yeah, I mean, more symbolic than anything else. China had developed its own economic centers at this point. But yeah, an incredibly symbolic moment for China. You know, it was already pretty clear at this point that China was a pretty big superpower, and that, you know, their century of humiliation was long in the past. But this definitely exemplified that. I mean, Britain was not a great power at this point in any shape or any sense of the word, but still symbolic in the way that if you had, you know, gone back 100 years, of course it was the exact opposite. Britain was this global empire that ruled the world, and China was a once great kingdom, which was really reaching its low point. But now the situation had flipped. China was this growing superpower that was on its way to being one of the top 2 powers in the world. Maybe, who knows what happens eventually. We've got the future ahead of us. And Britain was much reduced, right? So quite an important moment symbolically.
Two years later, Portugal returns Macau to China. Both territories are promised limited autonomy under a one country, two systems approach. Many predict that the rise of China's middle class will lead inevitably to increased demand for political rights. This, after all, is the lesson of 19th century Europe. US President Bill Clinton even warns China that its record on human rights puts it on the wrong side of history.
It's a funny thing for Bill Clinton to say. And, you know, I mean, just a mild point on this. I mean, there's plenty to criticize in terms of China when it comes to civil rights, but you can understand, or at least I can understand, why some people find this incredibly hypocritical coming from, for example, the United States. You know, some Chinese people or supporters of the Chinese government say, so you're criticizing us, but look at you. It's like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of civil rights violations going around in many different places, I'll say that much. And I feel free to criticize everybody at my own pace. Anyway, on the broader point of the middle class, yeah, one of the lessons learned from the industrialization of the West was that you see this developing middle class, and it leads to demands for political rights, which leads to modern liberal democracies. But China does things in a different way. They always have, right? I mean, they industrialized, they grew in a different way, a much faster way than a lot of these Western powers. And so those expectations have not really come to bear. China's had a massive middle class for a couple of decades at this point, right? At least since the 90s, what we're seeing now. And it has not yet led to some sort of massive liberal democratic revolution. I mean, I can't tell the future, but the predictions so far have not come to bear.
Around the world, there is a confident assumption that prosperity will make China more like the West. In defiance of such expectations, the 21st century sees China continue to grow in economic power and international stature, while at home, the Communist Party continues to rule virtually unopposed.
Yeah.
In 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization. Chinese goods become cheaper and more competitive than ever.
And they were already pretty competitive.
Within a few years, China is the world's largest exporter.
Jesus.
More and more foreign companies offshore their manufacturing to China to take advantage of cheap labor.
That's crazy, man. Like, look at this chart. What really stands out to me is you see a dip with the global financial crash of 2008, but then an immediate recovery. I mean, it shows you how invested people were in China, how much they relied on its economic growth, that even a recession of massive scale, did not put even a long-term dent in that growth of foreign direct investment.
The Chinese economy grows at rates other nations can only dream of. 10, 12, then 14%. It is, the World Bank declares, the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history.
Yeah.
The only thing keeping pace is the country's carbon emissions and air pollutants.
Yeah.
In 2008, China hosts its first Olympic Games. It is the perfect stage to showcase a new China to the world. Prosperous, confident, and ambitious. The opening ceremony is an awe-inspiring spectacle that celebrates thousands of years of Chinese history.
Yeah, and I mean, at this point, China was truly a major member of the global stage, a global superpower, and would only continue to grow in power from here. China has really managed to integrate itself into the global capitalist economy and benefit greatly from the global capitalist economy, while the Communist Party has retained control of its power and sort of resisted what you see a lot of countries going through, which is to integrate yourself into the global economy. You essentially must bow down to foreign corporations and allow them to make some of your political decisions for you, while things have been done quite differently in China.
In 2009, China overtakes Japan to become the world's second largest economy, behind only the USA. Communist Party rule is not entirely uncontested. Far from Beijing, in Tibet and Xinjiang, there are protests over the perceived injustices of its rule. They are met with force and mass detention. The entire country, meanwhile, is subject to increasingly sophisticated surveillance and strict censorship. The Great Firewall helps to keep Chinese citizens safe from harmful foreign ideas.
Yeah, another way in which China has really got its own thing going on, which is, the rest of the world, not the entire rest of the world, but a lot of the world uses the same sort of social networks online. But China has just got its whole entire parallel system where they've got a whole series of different websites and apps and these systems that they use, not exclusively, but mainly in China, right? So once again, they've got their own thing going on.
While the internet is continuously patrolled for any sign of dissent, the Communist Party guarantee of stability, security, and prosperity comes at a price.
Yeah.
The freedoms that are taken for granted in many other parts of the world. In 2012, after 10 years of leadership, the cautious, technocratic Hu Jintao passes the baton to a new leader, Xi Jinping.
This guy. I mean, when we're talking about important Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping has been moving his way up the list. He has really secured himself with an not unprecedented, but almost unprecedented level of power. He's becoming not just another Chinese leader, but one of the most powerful Chinese leaders we've seen in the modern history of China.
A century on from the abdication of the last Qing emperor, China is a country that has been utterly transformed. The road has been long, bloody, and turbulent.
Yeah.
But there is no doubt that the Middle Kingdom has resumed its natural place at the heart of global affairs.
That is true.
Would you like to see new episodes from Epic History weeks before they're out on YouTube?
Okay, I believe they are promoting their Nebula. You got Nebula, so I'll have their video linked down below so you can go and check it out. Please give them a like, subscribe, show Epic History support for making these fantastic videos. And here we are at the end of their series on China. There's so much left to say, but we've said so much already, so I won't extend this any longer than it needs to go. Truly a fascinating series. I think very important to modern geopolitics and our future, right? China is one of the, it's one of the top 2 most powerful countries in the world, the U.S., China. Now, we're entering a multipolar world. There are other powerful states, and who knows how things go. But China, everyone's looking at China, right? So yeah, it's important to see how they got where they are today, to take a look at that history, just to see how remarkable and rapid a lot of that development was. And now we're in the era of Xi Jinping, who, like I said, has quite a lot of power compared to some other Chinese leaders. But anyway, that was a fantastic video. I very much enjoyed it. I enjoyed the whole series. If you guys enjoyed these reactions, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, link down below, all that good stuff. I hope you're all having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.